Hello and welcome to this video. I've just filmed a top 10 greatest progressive rock double albums. At number 2 I put Tales from Topographic Oceans. At number 1 I put this album, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis. When I was doing the video I realised if I started to discuss these two albums I was going to go on for a long time, so I decided to just create these two videos. This is the second video where I discussed Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I've just done one where I've discussed Tales from Topographic Oceans, and I'm really going to give you my personal opinion about these albums and the way I see them. It's going to be entirely personal. I'm no great absolute expert on the history of these albums and how they were made. I know some of that, and that will feature it, but it's more my personal take on the albums. These are both troublesome albums, but also masterpieces at the same time. This one here, what I've stated is I think this is the greatest progressive rock double album of all time. That's what I've basically said. Does that mean this album is completely artistically successful in the same way as saying Selling England by the Pound is, or Nursery Crime? I'm not so sure. There is an idea with this album that, the same with Topographic Oceans, that it meanders a little, and that we have missing, we have maybe a side of too much material, and I think that happens around about side 3. You know, whether you feel perhaps, and this is not my opinion as such, it's the sort of general consensus that there's a little bit too much and it meanders, right? So, let's begin. Genesis, right, are the quintessential English progressive rock band. Okay? These guys, not so much Phil Collins and Steve Hackett, but, you know, Rutherford and Banks and Gabriel, have come from the upper echelons of sort of the English class system. You know, they are a Charterhouse private school. And this is a product of the upper middle class. This is upper middle class rock music, which pulls in a lot of English subject matter, literary allusions, romantic ideas, you know, from romantic poetry. And Genesis are brilliant at winding all that in to a rock music setting. I think on the obviously the first album's an anomaly, the one that Jonathan King produced, which is sort of this psychedelic pop album. And then with Trespass we start to hear this sort of ethereal English and at some points quite menacing take on rock music. Genesis are a slow burner. They are there quite early on in the history of progressive rock, but they don't really find their sound until 1971 for me, when Phil Collins and Steve Hackett join and we get Nursery Crime, which is, I think, my favourite Genesis album. And the reason why I like Nursery Crime so much is because it's so Genesis-y. It's just got all that whimsical, you know, floaty, ethereal and yet menacing and troublesome thing that Genesis do so well. That sound is then progresses, as all progressive rock should do, on Foxtrot and Selling England by the Pound. When they get to this album, I think Peter Gabriel, especially when you consider where he goes with his solo career, there's a strong interest in soul, there's a strong interest in R&B, of American music forms. And American music forms haven't featured that much. They are there, of course, because this is rock music, but they haven't featured that much in the early Genesis albums. And the thing that makes this album different for me in Genesis's catalogue is that there is a bringing in of an English view of American culture, and it's just all over this album. And this isn't sort of under the surface. It forms the idea of this album. Okay, it it's a sort of Americanization of Orpheus in the Underworld or Paradise Lost. It's a journey, or even Canterbury Tales. It's a journey that the character goes on through this sort of surreal, almost like hell, which is placed behind the facade of our English view of American culture. And on side one, they almost take that facade and they literally pierce it and rip it open and enter into something, this other world that exists underneath American culture. And it's definitely an English take on American culture. So if I pull the album out, okay, and I get wrong disc, double albums, eh? And this is an album that tells a story. Topographic Oceans has got conceptual continuity. It's trying to tell a story, but it's definitely an esoteric story. This definitely tells a story. It's all over the album. You know, you open up the double album, and inside there's this great long story that's being told. It opens up with Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and what we have here is something that's completely new for Genesis. What we have is all these Americanizations. Early morning Manhattan, ocean winds blow on the land, the movie palace is now undone. So we get that reference to Hollywood film. The all-night watchmen have had their fun, sleeping cheaply on the midnight show, same old ending, time to go. We're bringing in a cinematic element straight away. Nighttime flyers feel their pains, drugstore take down their chains, metal motion comes in bursts. And we feel this idea of New York waking up, and we have this character of Rail with his spray can going out to do graffiti. You know, some American kid, you know, Puerto Rican kid with a spray can going out to do graffiti. This is completely un-Genesis-y. And then we go, for me, which is one of the greatest moments in progressive rock, which is Fly on the Windshield. And we get that ethereal Genesis sound, and over that Peter Gabriel intones, there's something solid forming in the air. The wall of death is lowered in Times Square. No one seems to care, they carry on as if nothing is there. The wind is blowing harder now, blowing dust into my eyes. The dust settles on my skin, making a crust I cannot move in. And I'm hovering like a fly, waiting for the windshield on the freeway. Right? So suddenly we see this transformation going on. Rail is entering into an underworld at this point. And then we get Broadway Melody of 1974, which is basically a catalogue of American cultural icons. We've got the Broadway Everglades, we've got Lenny Bruce, Marshall McLuhan, we've got Groucho Marx, the Ku Klux Klan singing In the Mood by Bing Crosby. You know, we've got a cheerleader, you know, we've got Carol Chessman, Howard Hughes, Winston Cigarettes. So this is quite apparent that this is a conscious integration of American culture into the Genesis sound for me. Okay? I just want to add that Phil Collins' entrance into the band is so important with Genesis. And Phil Collins, again, is a drummer that is bringing in such a heavy groove from soul and R&B. You know, I think Phil Collins' last album he ever made was a tribute to Motown. You know, so that influence is in there. It's always been in there with Genesis. I think we see that Gabriel at this point, and I think this is the key to Tales of Topographic Oceans and Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, is this is a natural thing that happens to bands. Bands form, the magical entities come together, and they reach a point where everything is working together. The personalities are in, you know, complete union, and I think that's what we get on Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, and Selling England by the Pound. I think for most Genesis fans, Selling England by the Pound is their favourite album, because I think they're at their peak, and that coincides with the peak of progressive rock in the early 70s, around about 72, 73. Everything's come together. And at that point, the personalities, they start to, there's a tension. And we see this with Yes, with Tales of Topographic Oceans. And I definitely think we see this here with Genesis. And I think that pull is Steve Hackett wanting to go more towards something, you know, progressive, you know. And I think his compositions and approach are getting pushed down, probably by Tony Banks, I feel. And Peter Gabriel is also pushing. Also, there was things in Gabriel's personal life with his family that were also informing this album. So, as with Tales of Topographic Ocean, they go in with this idea of creating an epic, because it's been proved to these bands that epics sell. You know, so what if epics sell, let's go further in, and especially with nursery crime. I've gone blank. The big epic on Foxtrot on side 2. Oh my God! How often does this happen to me? Now I've forgotten the name of it. It will never come back. Sorry. Oh, this is ridiculous. This is what happens when you get old. The amount of times this happens to me, and YouTubers will edit this bit out, and I can't be arsed editing them out because I don't like editing my videos. I wish I'd never gone there with this now. Right, so I'm going to have to look this up. This is ridiculous. It's always Genesis that does this. I can remember when I forgot Tony Banks' name on a video. So I'm on Wikipedia now. Supper's ready. I haven't even looked. Supper's ready. So with Supper's ready, which I think if we were going to take one track and say when are Genesis at their peak in terms of progressive rock Genesis, it's Supper's Ready. And where that track should have been a huge commercial failure, because who makes, you know, sidelong tracks, you know, on sort of this sort of surreal subject matter, and yet these albums are selling millions and they're doing really well. And so my point is that at this point in 73, 74, these bands are going in with the commercial pressure to make epics. Every progressive rock band is trying to outdo themselves for epic. But at that point, the bands are often at a point of tension. And I think that's what you have with Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Now, they're trying to tell a story, and that story has to be told. And I think in terms of albums, there's a slight lack of concision here, especially around side 3, as they're trying to get this story to turn around. And I always felt as a kid that although it did meander a little bit there, they pulled it so back together, you know. And on the final track, I felt that was so life-affirming, that we'd finally gone through all this darkness and this twistiness, and I really enjoyed that. And I never felt that this album meandered. I never have done. You know, I've always loved this album. Topographic Oceans I did a little when I was a youngster, and on that video I explained my position. But anyway, with this album, I think you have to consider the story they're trying to tell, and if you're following the story through, you know, if you're sat there doing what they want you to do, which is following this story that's written here with all these illustrations of what's going on, it's a film for your ears. And if you're following it, it doesn't meander. If you're just putting the album on and listening to its music, it will seem like that. But if you do what Genesis want you to do, you will get that. Now, I think one of the things with this album is that for some people, and I think before I did this channel, if you'd have asked me what's your favourite Genesis album, I would have just straight away said Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And then going back and thinking what I like about Genesis, then it becomes Nursery Crime, because I like that whimsical, ethereal English thing. Genesis do something on this album that we don't hear again, because then Gabriel's gone, and then pretty soon Steve Hackett's gone. This is the only time we ever get this. This album stands in their catalogue alone. This huge epic right in the middle stands alone, you know. Obviously they then went out on tour and tried to tour this, you know, and people went and bought tickets to a tour where they just got to see this show, because it is like a Broadway show. It's like a surreal inversion of a Broadway show, a little bit like what Frank Zappa did with Thingfish a few years later. It's a bridge too far. Going back and listening to this album now, I think it's an absolute masterpiece, and I do think it's perhaps Prog's greatest epic. That's what I think, and deserves a place at number one. Anyway, that's my take on Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like the video, like. If you want to subscribe and watch more, please subscribe, ring the notification bell. And if you want to support me on Patreon, you can. The Patreon link's there. And please, you know, go and check out Patreon, because I've got so much content up there now, and there's so much interesting stuff, and it's such a rewarding place, you know, to be able to go to, you know, somewhere where we've got quite a few people there now, and they're, you know, we're having great discussions, and it's a very enjoyable experience, and the more the merrier, that's what I say. So thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one.